Left alone one morning to watch the house and in need of something to vent his spite on, Noboru began to rummage through his room. A large chest of drawers was built into the wall adjoining his mother's bedroom. He pulled out all the drawers, and as he was dumping their contents onto the floor, he noticed a trickle of light spilling into one of the empty compartments of the chest. He thrust his head into the space and discovered the source of the light. Strong summer sunlight was reflecting off the sea into his mother's empty bedroom. There was plenty of room in the chest. Even a grown-up might squeeze in up to his belly if he lay flat. Peering at his mother's bedroom through the peephole, Noboru sensed something new and fresh about it. The shiny brass beds his father had ordered from New Orleans were set against the wall on the left side, just as they had been before his death. A bedspread was smoothed neatly over one of them, and on the white cloth a large letter K. Kuroda was the family name. A blue straw sun hat, trailing a long pale blue ribbon, lay on the bed. On the night table stood a blue electric fan. Across the room, near the window, there was a dressing table fitted with an oval three-piece mirror. The mirror was not quite closed. The upper edges of the glass glinted through the cracks like splinters of ice. In front of the mirror rose a small city of bottles, eau de cologne, perfume sprays, lavender toilet water, a bohemian glass goblet, facets glittering in the light. A crumpled pair of brown lace gloves lay withering like cedar leaves. A couch and two chairs, a floor lamp, and a low delicate table were arranged directly under the window. An embroidery frame, the beginnings of a pattern needled into the silk, was propped on the couch. The vogue for such things had passed long ago, but his mother loved all kinds of handicraft. The pattern seemed to be the wings of some gaudy bird, a parrot maybe, on a background of silver grey. A pair of stockings lay in a heap next to the embroidery. The shocking embrace of sheer nylon and the imitation damask of the couch gave the room an air of agitation. She must have noticed a run on her way out and changed in a hurry. Only dazzling sky and a few fragments of cloud, hard and glossy as enamel in the light bouncing off the water, could be seen through the window. Noboru couldn't believe he was looking at his mother's bedroom. It might have belonged to a stranger, but there was no doubt that a woman lived there. Femininity trembled in every corner. A faint scent lingered in the air. Then a strange idea assailed him. Did the peephole just happen to be here? An accident? Or, after the war, when the soldiers' families had been living together in the house, he had a sudden feeling that another body, larger than his, a blonde, hairy body, had once huddled in this dusty space in the wall. The thought soured the close air, and he was sickened. Wriggling backwards out of the chest, he ran to the next room. He would never forget the queer sensation he had when, flinging open the door, he burst in. Drab and familiar, the room bore no resemblance to the mysterious chamber he had seen through the peephole. It was here that he came to whine and to sulk. It's time you stopped coming into Mother's room so often with that excuse about wanting to watch the ships. You're not a child any more, dear. Here that his mother would put aside her embroidery to help him with his homework, while she stifled yawns, or would scold him for not trying his necktie straight, or would check the ledgers she brought home from the shop. The opening sort of second page there from Yukio Mishima's The Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea. This is originally published in 1963 and was translated pretty swiftly into the English in 1965 by John Nathan, which I believe is the only translation. It's the translation that I'm reading. Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea. Mishima is a name that's been around for various reasons. Not only great writing, but Sun and Steel is a book that's often heralded as great. Though I will say this is my first Mishima and the only Mishima I've read. So my comments and appreciations of the novel and of Mishima really as a whole at this point are solely bound to this book. How would I describe The Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea? I will give you some alliteration for that. Sweet, soft, sickly, sexual, sensuous, and symbolic. The book is overflowing with a sensuality that is simultaneously sweet, loving, and sexual, and striving to have a sensuous, real, aesthetic engagement with the world, whilst there is a shadow form of that engagement in the sense of each of those ideas inverted into a sort of behind-the-scenes darker realm, which we really see encapsulated in that opening thing. So where you have the sweetness of the world, there's equally this form of sickliness, of an alien liminal nature that makes you feel quite uneasy. Where things are soft, the softness is often too much to the point of a grasping or a despair, or even like a melancholy, a sickness. Once again, with the sexuality, of course, this is opening here, and this is really the underlying structure that I'd like to focus on. But opening here with Noboru peeping into his mother's bedroom, we have a subtle beginning with a subtle incestuous nature looking into the sensuality and sexuality of his mother's private life, which then eventually does this develops into him quite literally watching her have sex with a man that she meets, who is the sort of the third player in this novel. So we have Noboru, this fatherless 13-year-old boy, Fusako, who is his mother, who is a very Western, sort of modern mother, quite materialistic, as we can see from that opening, and a sailor, it's kind of melancholic and a bit reticent, Ryuji. Apologies for any mispronunciations of those names. But to go through them, Noboru, a fatherless 13-year-old, is really the protagonist of the novel. His mother, Fusako, and then Ryuji, this sailor. And I will go through the plot, and then I want to hone in on this, what I see as something that I haven't really seen commented on too much, which is an extremely well-crafted Freudian foundation to this novel that handles the tightrope of Freudian honesty extremely well and courageously, whilst at the same time holding the reader at arm's length, especially when you're not overtly familiar with Japanese culture, which is some of the themes that we'll get to that are represented by these characters. But what we're looking at is ultimately on the surface and like aesthetically on the surface, and often transparently on the surface. And Mishima has an ability with symbols for people such as myself, who, if I go and read a novel that's in the tradition of symbolism, or a romantic novel in the sense of the genre or something like that, or any novel that's really dealing with symbols, I'm pretty much oblivious to them most of the time. I don't have the innate thing to read into them, and I don't really like reading. I don't like reading into symbols. I feel it's often contrived, often very forced, and you can end up doing really what you want with them if you're looking for something. This is why, for me, holds a very special place in sort of something that I've never, or at least I haven't seen done this well, is that Mishima has an ability, often a bit ham-fisted, admittedly, with symbols to make even pig-headed people who are ignorant of symbols, such as myself, to see what he is doing with them very clearly. I mean, there's an overflowing, almost obnoxiously, once again, sickening and sexual abundance of phallic and vaginal of symbolism constantly throughout this novel, which makes complete sense because we're looking at a novel about the adolescent desire for a form of freedom that is really only distinct to adolescence, to specifically, I would say, young men. This understanding of being alienated from society, thinking that you know it all, equally having a solitary nature in relation to the adults around you, and finding your way throughout the world with that as your foundation, amidst what is a rampant overdrive of hormones and sexuality, which for a character like Noboru, who has a distinct intuitive relationship with feeling and sensuousness, transforms this into something far more complex. But it follows Noboru, so he's fatherless, as we know from what the passage that I read out, and he has a gang of we say moral nihilist friends who meet up in sort of odd little areas, sort of alleyways or weird little sort of offcuts. They mention at one point they try to find areas where they might be found for the excitement of it. Who are led by a chap who's just called Chief, and they talk about the kind of things that a 13-year-old boy, I think in all nations, would talk about, which is really this seed of honesty where you think you know it all. So they wax about, the corruption of the world, of greed, of them knowing, of freedom, of the sea, and things along these lines. Big ideas that when you see it from their perspective, you begin to question whether or not you've lost what you might have lost to your own childhood and that yearning towards a freedom. But at the same time, with experience, you also see their naivety, and their naivety is transformed for this novel. And there's one passage I'll read out that is quite grotesque into once again this duality and naivety that ends up from this freedom being transformed into a violence, into an obsession in a way. And they also obsess, and more so Noboru obsesses over his mother Fusaka's new love interest, a sailor named Ryuji, who Noboru and the group sort of idolize and then also demonize. This is maturation of adolescence, where from the idealization of an adult or father figure, or in this case a sort of hero who might be representative of something traditional in the biographical sense for Mishima. Idolizing these figures can equally transform into a sort of a hatred or a demonization on the flip side, which is still an idolization of an ideal. So Ryoji is placed in as this sort of representative of an ideal that whether or not he actually represents it himself, which I think is made explicit that he doesn't really. This is, for me, quite a lost and melancholic character. The teenage apprehension of this ideal, it doesn't really matter whether or not they see the reality of it. So the story does center on Noboru, but we're switching between different viewpoints, and there's two sections, summer and winter, which both have a fairly drastically different feel, but retain this economically sensuous language, which sounds like an absolute oxymoron. But Mishima has an ability to compact a serious amount of information into just a few lines, whilst retaining not just good prose, but symbolic prose that is beautiful and sweet and has a liminal feeling that one can only describe as the feeling of the last days of summer when you are in your younger years, the last days of the school summer holidays, or even maybe the last days of school, of this feeling of still being young, a feeling of still having that freedom, but something is coming to a head, and the freedom is maybe getting a bit stifled at some point, and you're in this liminal space. And another book that does that feeling well, not the whole of the book, but 2666, which I've reviewed before, the first section of that book, this sort of semi-Lynchian feeling is throughout this work, I feel. And it's that keeps the reader at bay. There is an emphasis in the novel on men and what it is to be a male, and I think specifically what it is to be a male for Mishima growing up, and the quest of a male to either become a hero, to become traditional, to undergo a hero's journey. And we're placed into a world where that possibly may not be something that is even really possible anymore, and the yearning from that ends up in a lot of destruction and a lot of sort of sensuous acts that are happening. But one thing I really want to focus on, and I think what for me, what this book is, this part of the section that I read, this opening chapter is, in terms of structure and construction, is one of the strongest, if not word perfect, opening chapters to a book I've read. It is so well constructed without being overtly ridiculous or absurd, or, as I said before, ham-fisted, that I was kind of in awe of Mishima's ability to ground such a complex idea so quickly. And the idea for me here that is clearly running throughout the whole book, it is two ideas in one. So the main idea is, what does it look like, and what is the alteration of personal experience in a young man when he is finally confronted with a teenage ideal being crushed, with the notion of the traditional world that he thought he would go into being crushed, with realizing his mother is banal and modern, in realizing that the adult male that he idolized isn't this seafaring Melvillian Ahab hero of the hero's journey, but maybe a melancholic, lost man who is just a sailor. And so the novel is dealing with teenage ideals being apprehended when they begin to fall apart, when the world will not uphold those ideals anymore. But the language and the prose of the novel is always battling with that in its sensuality. The beauty, so we're sort of intermingled with the point of view of Noboru, because the language speaks of a beauty and of ideals and of a truth that Noboru feels and sees in that teenage idolized sense. But the information regarding the plots and the actions and the reality is far different. And so it's at one and the same time a friction between ideals and reality, but specifically for an adventure-seeking, hero-seeking teenage male. And one of the ways that this is one of the things that's being done fantastically with this, and I can't remember who said this, but it's a quote that's always stuck with me about this question of when one becomes an adult. Forgive me because I can't remember who said this, but one person has said, one becomes an adult when they finally see their parents as people. So you've cast off the notion, you begin to cast off the notion of them as, the parent or the teacher or the tutor, all these different roles in society. And one day you see your parents doing something mundane or whatever it might be, and you see them as the person they are outside of that biological familial relationship. And there's a process of maturation to realize, you're outside of the protection, and there's also a freedom with that. And Mishima, in this opening section, is grounding Noboru in a Freudianism, in this fairly transparent Oedipal setting, where he's able to get into this chest of drawers in his room, which his mother locks at night because, she locks him in his room at night because she understands him still being a child, and so he might go off and do a load of escapades. So he's locked up in this room, but something's now beginning to break through because he's so bored that he gets into the chest of drawers and he sees into his mother's bedroom, and he sees this because of light glinting through, and it's light being reflected off the sea. So but ultimately via his desire for the sea, for that freedom, for that adventure of the teenage male, he then looks through the peephole, and because of this strange position that he's in, as I read in that first section there, initially he sees his mother's bedroom, it may be as it is, maybe in his idealized version, but it's not for him now as a child, because he's seeing all this sensuality. And this is ultimately, we're talking about Freudianism here. We're talking about the Oedipus complex in terms of the young male's fascination with his mother, and the father, or the father figure, as the sort of the competition. The attention that is from the mother. Well, the father has something and is doing something which is getting her attention more than the child. So that rupture that is happening. And what's strange is Noboru gets through this peephole, gets to glimpse into the room in an Oedipal sense, as if he is that, if he is the phallus that is the other in this sense. And it's full of sensuality. It's full of phallic and vaginal symbolism. And it's full of a low-grade jealousy on his part that I see as developing throughout the novel. Eventually he does witness his mother and Ryuji make love. And then this develops into, and this is why I'm amazed that no one's really commented on the Freudian aspects of this novel, at least that I found. I'm sure someone probably has. But this then develops into something very sort of transparently Freudian, in the sense that in the manner that Ryuji is filling in the father's role for a fatherless 13-year-old boy, and he's witnessing them have sex and have a sort of, once again, a sickly and sweet and sensuous reaction to that isn't sort of just reprehensible. He then begins to idolize Ryuji. And so ultimately he is making a hero out of the man that is, taking his place in that Freudian sense. And yet, as this develops, one of the smallest things that happens, it's just almost absurdly comical, is that he idolizes Ryuji as this sailor, this bastion of tradition, of a seafaring tradition, bastion of tradition in general in Japan, this sort of noble male. And yet, when Noboru is in the park one day, he notices that Ryuji is soaking wet, and he asks him what happens, and Ryuji just says that he was laying in a fountain because it was hot or whatever. And for Noboru, this is sort of too pathetic. He can't accept this as an answer to why this is. And then this is when the demonization of Ryuji begins. And it's ultimately a sort of competitive, jealous Freudianism all the way through, which does culminate, and I won't actually spoil that for once. It culminates in a very strange decision on Noboru's part as to what to do in that Freudian conflict. I think that the decision that's made is more interesting than what could have been in a rather banal sense. But I'll read out just a few more just varied excerpts and go over the themes, because it's a highly thematic novel. He hadn't been able to explain his ideas of glory and death, or the longing and the melancholy pent up in his chest, or the other dark passions choking in the ocean's swell. Whenever he tried to talk about those things, he failed. If there were times when he felt he was worthless, there were others when something like the magnificence of the sunset over Manila Bay sent its radiant fire through him, and he knew that he had been chosen to tower above other men. But he hadn't been able to tell the woman his conviction. He remembered her asking, "Why haven't you ever married?" And he remembered his simpering answer. It's not easy to find a woman who is willing to be a sailor's wife. What he had wanted to say was, all the other officers have 2 or 3 children by now, and they read letters from home over and over again, and look at pictures their kids have drawn of houses and the sun and flowers. These men have thrown opportunity away. These men have thrown opportunity away. There's no hope for them anymore. I've never done much, but I've lived my whole life thinking of myself as the only real man. And if I'm right, then a limpid, lonely horn is going to trumpet through the dawn someday. And a turgid cloud laced with a light will sweep down, and the poignant voice of glory will call for me from the distance. And I'll have to jump out of bed and set out alone. That's why I've never married. I've waited and waited, but here I am past 30. So that's Ryuji talking to Fusaku about why he hasn't married. And Mishima is allowing us entry into the transparency of heroic ideals, in that presented with the hero and we are given a glimpse into, oh well, what I really wanted to say. This is like the shower argument. You get in an argument with someone and you have a shower and you think, I wish I'd said that. I mean, this isn't he wants to be the hero, but he's not going to be. He's never been written like that. That might not even exist anymore. So we get a glimpse into that. We get a glimpse into Ryuji as really a melancholic failing ideal that maybe never was. And we have to bear and watch Noboru not just in this Freudian competition and struggle of jealousy and violence and we could say release of tension in strange ways, but equally we knowing really the destruction and deconstruction and dissipation of the ideals that he is after in a vague sense, in a naive teenage sense. We have to witness both times for him to struggle to the truth of that matter. But it's this struggle that culminates, well, not culminates, but ruptures out because of this constant miscommunication, because of this inability for this, ultimately, the young, idealized man who's desiring, he's desiring to be a hero, is desiring Ryuji to be a hero. He's desiring Japanese tradition. We have Ryuji, who is a failure of that tradition. It's just a job. He hasn't married because, well, not many people want to marry a sailor because he's away all the time. And then we have Fusako, who is a stern mother, whose husband has died, who's very westernized, very modern. And we see here the biographical problems for Mishima with his own struggles. And of course, there is a constant miscommunication where what guidance does Noboru have other than his own moral compass, which is being guided by a chap named Chief, who is part of this gang, and at one point, well, seizing the kitten by the neck, the Chief pierced the skin at the chest with the point of the blade and scissored a long, smooth cut to the throat. Then he pushed the skin to the sides with both hands. The glossy layer of fat beneath was like a peeled spring onion. The skin neck, draped gracefully on the floor, seemed to be wearing a cat mask. The cat was only an exterior. Life had posed as a cat. But beneath the surface was a smooth, expressionless interior, a placid, glossy white inner life in perfect consonance with Noboru and the others. And they could feel their own intricate, soot-black insides bearing down upon and shadowing it like ships moving upon the water. Now, at last, the boys and the cat, or more accurately, what had been a cat, became perfectly at one. And so there's this scene that really does arise out of nowhere of the torture and horrific killing of a kitten, which is once again a pretty ham-fisted, not shoehorned, but just a very brute force symbol of, once again, this duality of sickness and sweetness, and of young men being led by their own idealized versions of the world and not being taught by the idols that have failed, maybe because they don't want to see that fully disappear, and it ruptures in these bursts of things like this killing of the cat for the sake of understanding life, for the sake of such an act itself. And all the while, we are held, as I've said, we are held as aliens. I felt very alien to this book. It was partly the liminal space, partly the liminal feeling of sort of hazy summer days at like 3 p.m. and you're in a suburban town, in suburbia or something, right? You feel like you're nowhere and there's no time, kind of thing. It feels like that. You're as a teenager, you're often being just, well, we're going here today, so you're often sort of just going places, and there's no control, and there is little control in this novel in that sense. It's being controlled by Mishima economically and exquisitely by the prose. But as for Noboru and many of the characters, drifting. These aren't captains, and this world is alien and liminal. And at times, you wonder what the sensuality and the sensuousness is going to do. That is pretty much my comment on it, really. I think it's the perfect novel for a brilliant fictionalized understanding of the Oedipal complex, deeply rooted into a sick modern world, with archetypal characters still playing their roles and seeing what happens to the maturation of the young teenage man in that setting. And that is done exquisitely well. Now, am I going to be reading more Mishima? Absolutely. It's probably going to be some of the next fiction I read. After a book, I'm going to be reading Secret Agent by Joseph Conrad, but I was astounded at what Mishima could achieve in such a short space of time with this. Phenomenal book, sweet, sickly, sexual, sensuous, and strange. Read it on a train or something like that. But that is my short thoughts on The Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea by Yukio Mishima. Thanks for listening.